So this is an introduction to chapters 15 to 28. Trollope's introduced us to the main characters of this complex books in the opening chapters. So I'm going to briefly recap the strands of this novel before we see how they develop. The story takes place mainly in London with rural excursions, and the main characters are, for the most part, London-based. The main exception is Roger Carberry, but he also plays an important role in London life, popping up there at one or two points in the story. He and his young relative, Paul Montague, come closest to being the older and younger heroes of the tale, the baritone and tenor leads, if this were an opera. The Carberry family in London represent the best and worst of society. Lady Carberry, contralto probably, still pretty, disillusioned and tarnished by an unequal and unhappy marriage, struggles to keep her head above water, faced with the impossible task of supporting herself, her daughter, and her wastrel son on an inadequate and uncertain income. Sir Felix, who's a weak second tenor, is terminally useless, selfish, greedy, immoral, and amoral, and it's a moot point as to how much his character has been developed by bad parenting or innate viciousness. Henrietta, our soprano lead, has somehow managed to grow up with a strong moral sense and good principles that enable her to see not only the glaring faults of her overindulged brother, but also the weaknesses of her mother. The Melmottes are the sort of people whom Trollope distrusts and despises. Their success in life is due to clever swindles and tricks that both captivate and repel those around them. While much of society shuns them, there are many whose greed and desire to live way beyond their means lead them to court and flatter Mr. Melmotte in the hope of picking up some of the crumbs from under his table. The others, from the Longstaffs to the young reprobates at the Bear Garden, are the lesser roles that fill the stage and give a verisimilitude to this rich novel. More than any other of his works, this book, as its name implies, is about a whole society, its corruption and sham gentility. I think there are two major strands in this book, greed and love, and I thought it would be interesting to see how these are developed. It's actually not a very even contest, with greed taking up 10 of the next chapters, love only 4, and those are a bit dubious anyway. So first of all, greed. In chapters 15 to 17, Lady Carberry knows, though she hardly admits it even to herself, that Felix is hopeless. And rather than attempting to persuade him to reform, she decides that a marriage with Mary Melmotte is the best way forward. To this end, she has engineered an invitation to her cousin Roger's house in Suffolk, so that she and Felix can meet the Melmottes, who will be at the Longstaff's house, Caversham, nearby. She's not good enough at greed and deceit to be able to hide this design from Roger, so a quarrel happens almost at once. Roger, our baritone hero, is not impressed since he is impervious to greed. We briefly see another, slightly worthier form of greed displayed by the zeal of Roger's Catholic priest friend at dinner when he tries to convert Lady Carberry and perhaps even the bishop. This is just a sideshow, however, and doesn't impinge at all on the rush of the worldly after gain. But why are the Melmottes at Caversham? Well, because the Longstaffs are hopelessly in debt due to their own greed and swanky lifestyle, and Mr. Longstaff rather stupidly thinks that having Mr. Melmotte to stay will somehow lead to a magical improvement in his finances. Felix is greedy enough to obey his mother's instruction to join them at Carberry Hall, but he's so useless that he can't get there by either sensible train and turns up demanding brandy and soda at 4 in the morning. Roger is incensed by his attitude to all around him and longs to take him to task, prevented only by his scruples as host. Felix's behaviour the next afternoon at Caversham is calculated to put everyone's back up and also make it quite plain that he is going after the heiress. He takes Mari aside and sweet talks her enough to convince her that he is in earnest and that she does really love him. Remember, the brandy and sodas haven't yet ruined his looks. The Longstaffs don't really mind this carry-on as they are playing their own games. Mr. Longstaff is trying to sell a house to Melmotte and also to persuade his son to give it up, but Dolly Longstaff insists that he must have a half share of the proceeds. The female Longstaffs have made a treaty with their father that they will entertain the Melmottes only on condition that they can return for the London season. And why? Because the girls have still to snare rich husbands. We'll leave chapters 18 and 19 aside for the moment. In chapters 20 to 25, the Carberys are invited to dinner at Caversham, and Felix and his mother go to pursue their own ends. Henrietta, Hetta, is dragged along with them, but she has no part to play in their machinations. Lady Carbery tries to sweet talk Mr. Melmotte into liking her son, but is no match for him, and Felix carries on his game of entrapping Mari. On the day after the dinner, the guests return to town, leaving the Longstaffs desolate at Caversham, and it's then that the girls realise that their father is going to renege on the treaty. Their indignation, especially Georgiana's, knows no bounds. They have entertained the Melmottes, whom they despise, solely on the understanding that this would enable them to return for the rest of the season. Their father, disappointed in what the great financier can do for him, refuses. Georgiana is so determined to go to town that she agrees to accept an invitation from the despised Melmottes and see if she can get her husband that way. Desperate times have called for desperate measures. Her sister, Sophia, is already deciding to settle for a local squire. So we return to London and the Railway Board and discover that our tenor lead, Paul Montague, is to some measure falling prey to the prevailing atmosphere. He is perplexed and uncomfortable, but still enjoys the money, and I'm sorry to say, uses some of it to join the gambling set at the Bear Garden. Lord Nidderdale and Felix would like to sell some shares too to realise some money from the board, but they haven't quite understood that they must first buy some. We begin here to see that Lord Nidderdale has some saving qualities and a certain level of morality that might rescue him from the morass later in the book. Felix is pushed by his mother into seeing Mr. Melmotte to ask for permission to marry Mari, but is checkmated by Melmotte's questions as to his money and prospects. Melmotte, on discovering to what extent Felix had over-egged the cake of his prospects, almost admires his impudence. Felix carries on gambling, but starts to lose to Miles Grendel, who is possibly the worst of the bunch at the club. He's definitely a base, and he begins to realise that Miles is cheating. Mari's crush on Felix deepens, and poor Georgiana discovers that her London manoeuvre has been disastrous. She's ignored by her old friends, and even Dolly is moved to write to her father to tell him to take her away, as he thinks the Melmottes are not people with whom she should associate. Meanwhile, Mr. Melmotte is trying to work his way up the echelons of English society. He's now greedy for social recognition as well as money, which may prove not to be wise. The final fling with greed here is in chapter 28, when Felix and Dolly go to the city to buy some shares, using Mr. Melmotte as a broker for Dolly's gambling debts and, allegedly, giving Felix £1,000 of shares in return. No scrip changes hands, and Felix begins to wonder whether he has actually got anything for his money. Felix and Dolly have the first intimation that the wily old fox may be too many for them, but they are still way off realising the extent of his machinations. Felix has told Dolly how he saw Miles Grendel cheating and is surprised to hear that Dolly is more or less indifferent to the news that he has found so shocking. I'm afraid this might give Felix new ideas for money-making. And now, love. We first hear of love tales in chapter 18, and I'm sorry to say that the story is of the handsome town buck coming down to seduce the innocent country maid with his good looks and smart ways. Ruby Ruggles, a local lass, is too pretty for her own good and longs to escape from her tyrannical grandfather and unexciting marriage prospects. It's inevitable that she would come in Felix's way, and just as inevitable that he should trifle with her. Ruby is enchanted, and even Felix enjoys a half hour in the woods with a bit of kissing. But Ruby is no Hetty Sorrel, and Felix is too lazy to get as far as ruining her, so he leaves her with hopes, dreams, and not much else. In chapter 19, Hetta has a far more serious lover. Roger is good, kind, well-intentioned, thoroughly in love with Hetta, and, let's face it, a bit of a bore. He's also nearly twice Hetta's age, and Trollope's heroines don't rush to marry much older men in the way that Dickens's did. Now that Hetta has met Paul Montague, Roger doesn't stand a chance for all his worthiness. And meanwhile, what's Paul up to? Is he true to Hetta? Well, yes and no. In chapter 26, we meet the beautiful, clever, and American Mrs. Hurtle, who travels out of Paul's past to London to demand why he is wishing to renege on earlier promises of love that he had made to her on a sea voyage. Paul has found that her reputation is rather shady and also fears that she might not be quite so much of a widow as he thought. There's something of the Wild West about her, which is exciting but not exactly fitted for London society. Paul has also since met Hetta and realised that, though fascinated by Winifred Hurtle, he isn't truly in love with her. She is determined not to let him go. Does she really love him, or is she just unwilling to lose her power over him? Perhaps the fact that he is a bit younger than she is an added attraction. I'm sorry to say that Paul, a flawed hero, doesn't quite know how to break with her and does rather silly things like taking her to the play, going to her lodgings as an acknowledged fiancé, and kissing her. He seems to be working his way into a love triangle. The plot can only thicken. Before I go, I would just like to add that it's not just about the plot and the story, it's also Trollope's style, the beautiful phraseology, the humour, such as the treaty at Caversham, the characterisation, and even the humorous names. Sir Damask Monogram is almost believable. All in all, Trollope is just such a joy to read. That's it.